So we're working with this beautiful beaded mesh fabric that I got from Joann's. It has a lot of glass beads and sequins, which cost me a lot of needles later. And then I'm gonna use this crepe back satin that I got from Fabric Wholesale Direct as my lining. And this mesh tool that I got from Fabric Wholesale Direct as well. This is gonna help me give a little bit of poof to the skirt. I also got this matching brown thread from, I think, Fabric Wholesale Direct, and a zipper from Joann. Now the first thing I did was I started cutting out all my pattern pieces. I laid the beaded mesh fabric down and folded a part of it over, and then I used that to cut the front bodice piece on fold. And then I do the same thing for the back bodice piece, and I use my favorite fabric scissors to cut this beaded fabric out, and it absolutely destroyed my scissors. So please beware when you're using this fabric, just pay attention to your scissors. I think I may be able to get it sharpened and salvaged, but otherwise my scissors is completely useless now. Now we're going on to the sleeves. I used an existing sleeve pattern, except that I made a few changes, which was to lengthen the sleeve, and then I made the bottom of it a little bit more narrow so that this becomes a more fitted sleeve, not too tight, but it is a bit more close fitted to my arms than it normally would be. And then I used this semi-circle flare pattern piece to cut out the flared part of the Lahenga top. And after I finished cutting the beaded fabric, I went ahead and cut the same pieces for the bodice out of the satin lining fabric and also the mesh fabric. And now I'm gonna cut the skirt piece out. I folded in half lengthwise the satin lining piece, and then I'm gonna put over the beaded mesh fabric. I'm gonna lay out that first layer because this is a shifty fabric, so it does move around a lot. I'm gonna carefully spread it out and then fold it over again and carefully spread that layer out as well. I try my best to make sure that all the lines of the embroidery were kind of lined up properly. This just gives the seams a better finish. I think I did pretty well, I have to say. And then with my cutting mat and my rotary cutter, I cut out the waist measurements for a half circle skirt. At this point I was gonna do a half circle skirt, but later on I kind of ended up doing a full circle skirt for the beaded mesh layer. It gave a much more full look, and later you'll see I gathered up the waist to fit. Now at this point, I arranged all the bodice pieces together with each layer of fabric so that they move as one. And then I one by one cut out all of the beads from the seam allowance to make my sewing process easier. However, this still did not spare me from losing a whole pack of needles. Now, since this is 3 layers of fabric, that is the beaded mesh tulle, the regular plain tulle, and the satin fabric, I ended up trying my best to pin them all together and then pin the seams together just like one set at a time. And then I took that to my sewing machine and stitched them in place. And now that I've gotten my bodice pieces all sewed up together, I started to add the little flare to it. I pinned the middle in front of it, and then I started sewing all the way around. After I was done sewing the flared part of the top on, it was time to attach a zipper to the back for closure. So I'm gonna just hand baste the zipper in place first and then take it to the machine. So again, much like the bodice pieces, the sleeve is actually 3 pieces as well: the beaded mesh, the mesh tulle, and the satin lining. So I'm tediously going through each layer and making sure they all line up perfectly. And then I pinned the entire all the sides all around it. I pinned them in place, and then I folded that over, pinned it again, and took it to the sewing machine to sew a straight line down the length of the sleeve. Now that the sleeve has been sewn shut, I'm going to attach it onto the top. Now this part is pretty simple. You simply line up the side seams along with the sleeve seam, pin that in place, then pin the whole thing all around in place, and then give it a stitch. At this point, the top is pretty much finished, and I will later shorten the top and add a satin binding to it at the edge to give it a more cleaner look. And now we're gonna start doing the skirt. With the zipper foot still on, I ended up stitching the sides of, just one side of the skirt, and I used that selvage edge, and I sewed as close to that glue line as possible, and it gave the most cleanest finish to the side seam of the skirt. I'm so impressed by that. Now, like I mentioned before, I had to gather the waist of this skirt since it was double my waist measurement. So I did that by hand since it saved me a little bit more time on the machine. And then I started on the tulle layer of the skirt. I basically just let that roll out for a long time, and then I gathered the tulle as best as I could. This I did by simply scrunching up the fabric and pushing it towards the presser foot and sewing that in place. And I did that for a long time, I think I went past my actual waist measurements, but then I just trimmed that piece off anyways. It wasn't a big of a deal, since it did give me the amount of volume I wanted under the beaded mesh tool anyways. After I was done gathering up those mesh layers, I started working on the waistband of the skirt. This was simply a rectangle based on my own waist measurements, and I just cut that out. And after I was done cutting that out, I also cut out a piece of fusible interfacing, and then I put that on with my iron, and then I began attaching the gathered layers onto the waistband. At first I placed the beaded mesh down, and then at first I did pin this in place, but later on it was just not working. The gathers kept moving around, so what I did was I went in with a needle and thread and hand sewed all of the gathers down as best as I could to keep them in place. After I was done putting the beaded mesh down in place, I put the mesh tool after that, and I believe I pinned this in place, and then I took it all to the sewing machine and gave it a nice little straight stitch. And now that those two mesh layers are together on the waistband, I ended up pinning the satin lining onto the waistband as well and attaching that. Again, I had to basically sew this in two parts, where I did the mesh layers first and then the lining. Doing it this way, I believe, just helped me to make sure that all of the layers that were gathered were properly stitched down, and none of it was like bunched up or like stitched in the opposite direction, as sometimes that happens. So it was easier to have more control over all these voluminous fabrics with the waistband. At this point, this is how it was looking. I think it looks very pretty, but at that time I was not feeling this length, so I did cut half of it off. Oh, and this is me showing you how pretty it would look as a sharara, and it looks so stunning. Oh my gosh. And this is how it looks in like low light. It just sparkles. This fabric is absolutely beautiful. That was how many sewing needles I lost for this project. So I ended up hand sewing the lining part of this top together. I also finished off all the seams by hand sewing some twill tape onto it as well. And now we're gonna do the dupatta. So for this, I basically eyeballed a piece of fabric that I just like the length of it. So I want it to be a little bit dragging on the floor, and the rest of it should fall by my knee, basically. So that's how much I cut out. And then there was like a bit of a strip of fabric left over, so I cut that in half. And what I'm going to do with this is basically use it to bind the long sides of the edge of the dupatta. Now after I was done with all of that, I started to spread out the beaded mesh tool again. I'm gonna cut out a few strips. This is what's gonna act as the border for the entire dupatta as well. So I cut out 2 short pieces based on the measurements of the rectangle of the shawl, and then 2 long pieces as well. After I was cutting all of the rectangle pieces out, I folded them in half and give them a press to kind of help them stay in place. And then I placed them around the dupatta, and I'm gonna hand sew all of it together. Now, in case you were wondering how long it took me to hand sew all of this on, I took just about the entire last season of Squid Game. I watched a total of 6 dramas while I was working on this project. There was a lot of hand sewing, and there was a lot of bead removal. Also, I made like another top. I didn't like it, I changed it. And then also I made another dupatta, which took a long time, but it did not fit the final product of this lahenga, so I didn't use it either. So it took me a lot of dramas. Okay, now that the dupatta has been finished, I made a tassel to go on the skirt. Now this was pretty easy. I simply made a strip of fabric into a, what do you call those again, like a strap, and then I basically just sewed one side down and then turned it inside out with a bobby pin. And then I wanted to add that little thingamabob at the end of the tassel. I don't know what they're called, but I basically cut out a half circle shape out of a piece of paper, and I cut several of those out of the satin fabric that I wanted to use. This is how it looks when you sew it down, and so I added about 2 more over that one. So I basically placed it wrong sides attaching to the string, and then I just gave it a straight stitch right there and called it a day. I did this about 2 more times basically. And honestly, how pretty is that? Oh my goodness, it's so cute. So I wanted to make some pearl bead strings as well, and so I'm using those pearls that I got from Walmart and these glass beads that are basically remnants of the beaded fabric. These are like what I cut off for the seam allowance, and this is the general idea. I'm gonna use like a fat pearl bead and a skinny pearl bead and a mixture of both. I did not end up doing all of this, and the way the tassels were supposed to be sewn on, completely different. But what I ended up doing was I strung just a ton of like the fat pearls onto the embroidery floss that I have. This was it just better held up the weight of the pearls than the regular thread. And then I went ahead and just sewed it on. I forgot to add on enough allowance for me to be able to tie the knot at the top, but it worked out in the end, so I'm quite happy with that. And after that, I did the same thing again with the glass beads. Now, obviously, my hijab needed some razzle dazzle, so I used some jewelry making chain and loops and little butterflies that I had, and I made a little head chain to kind of match the beads that were on the fabric. So now to begin, I'm gonna use these earring hooks. I think for applying it to a hijab, this is the best little tool that you could ever use for head chains. And then I'm just gonna squish it so it's like tighter and stays on the hijab. After that, I just measured out a piece of that silver chain on my head, just about roughly about how I would like it to fall, and then I cut that out and laid it flat on the table. And using these jump rings, I started to attach the little butterflies onto the chain. I started in the middle and then kind of just eyeballed my way through, adding them like across the whole chain. And honestly, this came out so beautifully. It even looked really good as a choker. I'm not gonna lie. I think I need to make another one just for that reason. It was so pretty. And yeah, this is how I made that little head chain. It's just absolutely beautiful. And this is how beautiful the Lahenga came out. I styled it with this brown hijab. It's the only brown hijab that I found appropriate to a match, and it looks so beautiful all together. And I did add some bows to the sleeve and a bit of flare as well. Like I said, while I was making this Lahenga, I changed my ideas a lot, okay, but it came out so pretty. I am just so in love. I am so in love with how this came out, and I absolutely wish I had somewhere to wear it to. So yeah, catch me in my next video, and I hope you go ahead and make your own Lahenga as well. It was absolutely fun to make, a bit stressful, but it came through in the end. So yeah, goodbye.